program, I have the pleasure of introducing Grant. So, Sizemore. Anyway, he has a degree in zoology and environment science from Miami University in Ohio. Oh, my niece is going there right now. Um, and an MS in wildlife ecology and conservation at the University of Florida. We had a good time actually talking about wildlife while we had dinner. Um, he worked in wildlife conservation policy, education, and research for over 15 years. Wow, he looked really young for doing that. But anyway, and is certified wildlife biologist. He is currently the director of invasive species program at the American Bird Conservancy, where he run the cat indoor program. So outside of work, he enjoy hiking, birding, imagine that, and taking care of indoor cat. Anyway, welcome, Grant.
Okay. Hello, and thank you very much for having me. I'm Grant Sizemore. Thank you, Kim, for that introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about everybody's favorite topic, cats and cat management, right? Yeah. Okay. So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, basically we have a cat crisis in Texas and throughout the country. We have too many cats for the number of homes that exist for them, for the number of homes that want them. And so that has led to a major crisis that has implications not only for the cats themselves, but as we will see, for the health and welfare of a wide variety of wildlife, for issues associated with property rights, for public health. And so we're going to talk about the science associated with all of these concerns and some of the management that we can implement to alleviate those concerns and the impacts that cats have in the environment. So I hope by the end of this, you can all become Cats Indoors advocates. As Kim said, I run the Cats Indoors program. I hope you can all advocate for Cats Indoors policies and practices wherever you live. Okay. There we go. So I think it's helpful to know who you're getting your information from. So I want to quickly introduce American Bird Conservancy. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of native birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. So we work throughout the Western Hemisphere. We have offices in various parts of the country, but really a staff everywhere throughout the United States and a little bit internationally as well. And we focus on the full life cycle of bird conservation. So we're looking at not just where birds like to nest and reproduce here in the United States, but also where they winter and reside in the off season. And so maybe you have heard a little bit about this image on the left, 2.9 billion. This made some headlines a few years ago when the research study was published. But over the last 50 years, we have seen a net loss of about 3 billion birds in the United States and Canada. So we have 3 billion fewer birds than we did in the 1970s. And so this is causing quite a bit of concern among conservationists. But there are luckily some simple actions that have been recommended by a coalition of organizations to try to counteract this decline that we've observed. And among those are things like purchasing bird-friendly consumer products like shade-grown coffee, protecting windows because birds do not see glass. Like, people don't really see glass either, but we happen to pick up on the cues that identify that glass is probably there. Birds don't pick up on those cues and they fly headfirst into them. Planting native plants, and of course, keeping cats indoors. And then finally, American Bird Conservancy is tackling a lot of these bird conservation threats and addressing on-the-ground habitat management and preservation through a variety of programs. I mentioned already the collisions with windows, so we have some solutions available for people to implement at their home, at their office, wherever, where they can this is the image on the top left. That is, it provides the ability for birds to recognize that there is an obstacle in the way, and so that they do not fly headfirst into it and then die. We have a program called Splash, which I think has partnered quite a bit with the Texas Master Naturalist program. So maybe some of you have participated in that, but it's stopping the littering of plastics along the shoreline. It works a lot on the Gulf Coast of Texas, as well as across the Gulf Coast of the United States. We are working on protecting Hawaiian forest birds from avian malaria, which is an introduced pathogen spread by an introduced species, which is mosquitoes in Hawaii. All of those birds are on the verge of extinction, unfortunately, and doing some work with golden-winged warblers up in the Great Lakes region, modifying habitats to early successional habitat, which benefits a wide variety of species, but in particular golden-winged warblers. This is just a snapshot of some of the work that we're doing. We do a lot more than this, but just to give an idea of what American Bird Conservancy is all about. So, if I can leave you with one message today, it is this: that domestic cats can make wonderful pets. As Kim mentioned, one of the things I do is taking care of my own indoor cat. But when cats are allowed to roam outdoors, they can cause significant harm to birds and other wildlife, and as well have implications for public health, nuisances, and other things. So domestic cat management is absolutely essential. We have to do it. And American Bird Conservancy has recognized that. We have a whole program dedicated to responsible cat ownership and effective unowned cat management called the Cats Indoors program. So I want to just lay out some terminology for the rest of this talk, by the way, because these get used and misused in a variety of contexts. And so domestic cat means that's the common name for the species. So it has no meaning associated with the tameness or lack of tameness for that specific cat. That is a biological definition. The other ones that are associated with more of these behavioral traits associated with cats: free ranging or free roaming, or at large or outside cats. These are cats that are roaming around outside without restriction. Stray cats are a subset then of free ranging cats. They tend to be habituated to people. And then feral cats tend to be those that are not habituated to people. So speaking of domestication, domestic cats were domesticated about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. Their closest relative is the Near Eastern wildcat, pictured here. But since their domestication in that region, they have been transported around the world because of their close association with people. This is a 2011 study which looked at cats on islands. And as you can see, it is truly a global species at this point. And of course, not represented is the continents. They are on every single continent except Antarctica. Now, cats are obligate carnivores. They have to eat meat to survive. And one of the unique traits associated with domestic cats is that they are instinctive predators. And probably everybody has observed this trait. If you've ever seen a cat play with a feather toy or a laser pointer, you are triggering an instinctive prey drive response from that individual cat. That cat is not hunting that feather toy because it's hoping to consume it. They are smarter than that. But they will engage in that predatory response. So they will, stalk it. They'll pounce on it. They'll grab it with their front paws. They'll maybe kick it with their hind paws. They'll bite it. That's great enrichment for an owned cat inside the house. But when that same behavior is taken outside, suddenly it is fatal for wildlife. And these cats, whether they are fed or not, will hunt and kill wildlife. I think that's pretty well known, but there have been a lot of studies that have shown this. One of the studies that highlighted this trait of domestic cats is called the Kitty Cam study. It was published in 2013 in partnership with University of Georgia and National Geographic, and they put little video cameras on the collars of owned cats and then observed what they got up to when they were roaming outside. All of these cats were well fed. They had food in their bowls when they got home, but many of them, of course, hunted. And they killed wildlife, like the wildlife you can see pictured here, an eastern phoebe and a chipmunk. And one of the interesting things that they found was not necessarily that they killed wildlife. That's sort of not earth-shattering. We already knew that. But the magnitude of wildlife that they killed. So many of the studies that have looked at domestic cat impacts on wildlife have relied on prey returns to the home to try and quantify how big an impact cats have in the environment. And what they found was that only 23% of prey that were killed by cats were actually returned to the home. So when a cat owner says, well, my cat only kills about one bird a month, no big deal, right? Actually multiply that by 4 or 5 times, and then multiply that by all the cats roaming in the environment. And you start to get a sense for the scale of mortality that we're talking about for wildlife associated with cats roaming outdoors. And one of the important points here is also from a 2020 study that because of the incredible density of cats operate in a way that is unlike natural predators, natural wildlife, native wildlife. They exist, again, in close association with people. They're able to exist in incredible densities, much higher than native predators, in part because they are fed. You know, a cat, if it doesn't make a kill, it goes home, it eats its kibble, has access to clean food, clean water, clean food, shelter, veterinary care. It is not subject to the same predator-prey dynamics that other wildlife or that wildlife would be subject to. So you get these incredible densities of domestic cats in the environment. And what research has found is that domestic cats actually kill 2 to 10 times more wildlife than a similarly sized native wild predator. So the point here really is that owned cats will kill wildlife. And this has implications for a wide range of wildlife. And, you know, we often think about domestic cats as individuals and not necessarily about wildlife as individuals. You know, as biologists, we're trying to think at the population level, really. But of course, there are, you know, every single animal is an individual. And when a domestic cat is out there roaming and hunting and killing wildlife, that has a significant impact for that individual animal. And so we can see with this golden crowned kinglet and this hermit thrush, you know, those are individuals that will not get the chance to reproduce or migrate or whatever the case may be. But we're seeing that even when the domestic cat doesn't directly kill that individual animal, because of the nature of a cat bite, it's got sharp teeth that puncture down through tissues, and in its mouth is bacteria that can lead to infection. We see that many of the prey items that cats are not necessarily directly killing end up dying as a result anyway. And there have been a couple of different studies that have looked at the outcomes of wildlife submitted to wildlife rehabilitation facilities. So these are wildlife that are lucky enough to get access to veterinary care. And even with veterinary care, I believe it's 78%. Yeah, 78% mortality rate was observed for birds submitted to wildlife rehab facilities. They're effective predators. Really, really quite astonishing. And they impacted in a study, again, of wildlife rehab facilities across the United States, they were impacting over 300 species. So this level of predation adds up, and it turns out the top source of direct human-caused bird mortality in the United States and Canada. And you can see a comparison here with the United States in red, Canada in blue, between domestic cats and other direct sources of anthropogenic bird mortality. But that was a log scale. So now let's take it out of that logarithmic scale and see how it really compares apples to apples with all these other forms of direct human-caused bird mortality. You can see it's not even close. Domestic cats kill 2.4 billion birds every year in the United States. The 95% confidence interval is 1.3 to 4 billion. The median estimate is 2.4 billion, which is what we tend to use. 2.4 billion birds are killed by cats every year. And now there has been some pushback on that study by certain interest groups that find it inconvenient for what they're trying to do. But I want to point out that similar studies in other countries have found quite similar results. And unfortunately, we're seeing that domestic cats roaming in the environment in the United States, Canada, China, Australia, all of the countries where these types of nationwide studies have been conducted are killing hundreds of millions to billions of birds, hundreds of millions to billions of mammals. There are also studies on reptiles, on amphibians. Basically, cats have a tremendous impact. There are so many individual domestic cats roaming in the environment that the cumulative impact of all of those cats out there combines to a tremendous and concerning level of wildlife mortality. And this level of mortality has an impact at the population and indeed even at the species level for wildlife. This is a graph from a 2016 study, which was looking at terrestrial invasive species and their impacts on birds, mammals, and reptiles. That's BMR there in the graph. And what they found was that domestic cats have contributed to the extinction of 63 species of birds, mammals, and reptiles. They continue to be a top threat to 430 species of threatened and endangered species. So one of the best case studies, I think, for the swift impact that cats can have in an environment is from the Stevens Island wren or Lyle's wren. Has anybody heard of the Stevens Island wren case? No, okay. New information. So the Stevens Island is an island in New Zealand. In about 1890, thereabouts, there was a lighthouse keeper who was appointed to, work the lighthouse, keep ships from crashing into the rocks. He brought with him his cat, which I've been told is named Tibbles, but I don't know if that's true or not. That's what was reported. But anyway, he and his cat arrived at the lighthouse. His cat, of course, at that time was allowed to wander. And the guy thought of himself as a bit of an amateur ornithologist. One day he noticed that his cat brought home a bird in its mouth that he had never seen before. Didn't know what it was, so he captured the bird, sent it off to the museum for identification, and what they found was it was a brand new species, unknown to Western science at that time. So in 1890, he arrived with his cat. In 1892, the species was extinct, killed by cats. Not just Tibbles, but other cats that eventually birthed from Tibbles also, but killed by cats very, 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 very quickly. So domestic cats can have population level impacts at a very tremendous rate. And they are listed by the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, to be among the world's most harmful invasive species worldwide. So in addition to this sort of direct predatory impact that cats can have in the environment, they can also modify ecosystems and alter behaviors. I'm sure that's, you're all familiar, of course, if they're having population level impacts, of course, that's going to modify ecosystems. But you can see from a variety of studies here in the top left, this graph shows that with or without cats, you get a larger assembly of birds, more native rodents, and fewer non-native rodents. But in similar habitats where you have cats available, fewer birds, fewer native rodents, and more non-native rodents. And then we've seen that the type of habitat also matters in this this graph here on the bottom right, that in fragmented habitats of a small enough size, small enough that they don't house coyotes, you get large numbers of domestic cats and few numbers of native birds. In fact, in that study, all of the ground nesting birds were completely extirpated. But in fragmented habitats of a large enough size where you get coyotes, they saw fewer domestic cats and larger numbers or prevalence of birds, including ground nesting birds still remaining in the environment. So I also want to draw your attention to this Bonington et al. 2013 study, which I think is pretty interesting. They used a model of a domestic cat, so like a stuffed cat or stuffed animal type. They placed it near the nest of a common blackbird for, I think, 15 minutes, and then they removed it and observed the nest over the next 90 minutes. And what they found was that the adults reduced the amount of food that they provided to the young in the nest by a third, and that there was an increased risk of predation by an order of magnitude. And that's from a cat that has virtually, or not virtually, it has zero potential for causing any direct harm to the nest because it's a stuffed cat, right? But because the cat was in the environment, the birds saw it, they recognized the threat, they had to spend their time engaging in anti-predatory response behaviors, chattering at it, letting the cat know, I see you, don't come kill us. And they weren't spending that time feeding their young. And then other predators in the environment heard that anti-predation response, and they were like, oh, there's a nest there. Let's go kill it. So just by having a cat, the mere presence of a cat roaming in the environment can reduce the reproductive success and survival of birds in the environment. So really just a quick review here. So domestic cats are not native to North America. They were introduced to this continent by people. And they are very effective, really dazzlingly effective, which is part of the allure of them, predators, and can have tremendous impacts on native wildlife populations where they are roaming the environment. So I want to move now away from the role of domestic cats as predators. I mentioned we might talk a little bit about human health components. And so let's talk about disease transmission. So this is a table of a variety of, I believe they're all, or at least mostly zoonotic diseases. Those are diseases that can be transmitted from people or from animals to people. It is a lot, and I'm not going to talk about all of those. I'm really only going to talk about two of them today, and that's rabies and toxoplasmosis. So, rabies. It turns out in the United States, cats are the top carrier of rabies among domestic animals. So wildlife still far more likely to carry rabies than domestic cats, but domestic cats are far more likely to carry rabies than dogs, which is what we kind of historically think about when we think about rabies. We think about Old Yeller, right? Or at least I do. But today it's Old Tabby or something, Cats outpace dogs about 4-1 in terms of confirmed rabid cases. And then domestic cats, as opposed to wildlife, disproportionately expose more people to rabies because people are far more likely to try to interact with an unknown cat than they are an unknown skunk or fox or raccoon. Not too many people are trying to pet an unknown fox. And if you know anybody who is, tell them to stop. But a lot of people will see a cat and they'll say, oh, that's just a friendly little stray or something. Then it comes up and all of a sudden you've got a rabies exposure and then have to undergo post-exposure prophylaxis, series of shots to make sure you don't get rabies and die. Because once symptoms show up, you're dead. Anyway, rabies, as you can see from this map, it tends to be more of an Eastern U.S. Occurrence. These red dots are confirmed cases of rabid cats, and you can see that cats tend to be more commonly rabid in the Eastern United States as well. That's associated with the outbreak of raccoon rabies virus variant. But there are plenty of rabid cats in Texas as well. So we're going to look at some of the Texas specific data here. This is from 1991 to 2020. And so you can see that this is the prevalence of confirmed cases of rabid domestic cats over that time period. It kind of oscillates, goes up and down. And this is the prevalence of total cases of domestic animals that are confirmed rabid. It also goes up and down, similar to the cats. But one thing that I think is interesting is that over that same time period, the percentage of total domestic animals that are confirmed rabid and that are cats, does that make sense, has increased over that 30-year period. So you can see it went from, about 50%, or sorry, about 20%, 25%, up to over 50% in that time frame. So it's clearly something we are doing for other domestic animals or not doing for domestic cats is leading to this trend here. There's a lot more we can do with regard to rabies protection associated with domestic cats. And next, I want to talk a little bit about the next disease, toxoplasmosis. Who has heard of toxoplasmosis? Some of you. Great. Yes, yes. So this is a disease caused by infection with the parasite Toxoplasma gondii. So it's a tiny parasitic protozoan which relies on felines to complete its life cycle. It can only sexually reproduce in the gut of a feline. And I am saying feline on purpose because that is domestic cats, mountain lions, jaguars, bobcats, lions, tigers, all of them. But so if it gets into a domestic cat that hosts Toxoplasma gondii, that parasite then reproduces in the gut of the cat then excretes the tiny infectious eggs called oocysts into the environment through its feces. A single domestic cat can excrete up to hundreds of millions of these oocysts, and they remain infectious in terrestrial environment, freshwater, marine systems for months to years. A single oocyst is enough to infect any warm-blooded species, any bird or mammal, and then the result can be toxoplasmosis, the disease form of that infection. So you can see kind of the life cycle a little bit of Toxoplasma gondii here on the right. It can move through the ecosystem from the oocyst stage in the environment into a variety of different intermediate hosts, including wildlife and people. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the implications of those infections here in just a moment. But one thing that I think is really unique and really morbidly fascinating maybe about Toxoplasma gondii is from this study on the left, this Burdoy et al. 2000. And what they found was they set up this experiment where they had rats infected with Toxoplasma gondii and rats not infected with Toxoplasma gondii. And they set up I'm just going to call it an arena, an area where the rats could choose to be or not to be. And in that little arena, they had different scents. So they could either be, they tested them with their own scent, with a neutral scent, which was water, with a rabbit scent, and with a cat scent. And what you can see highlighted here in red is that there was no significant difference between the amount of time I'm going to say toxo for short, by the way, a toxo-infected rat spent in the areas that were contained its own scent, water scent, rabbit scent, but there was a significant difference between those that were toxo-infected and not toxo-infected in where they chose to spend their time when it came to the cat scent. Those rats that were infected with Toxoplasma gondii chose to spend way more time in the area that had the cat scent. And so what we have identified is actually that this parasite is a zombie parasite. It can modify the behavior of its host organism. And what happened in the case of this rat here is that it changed the way it perceived the risk and desire, I guess, associated with the presence of a domestic cat. And so what this means for the parasite then is if a Toxoplasma gondii infected rodent, like a rat, is more likely to spend time in an area inhabited by a feline, it increases the likelihood of predation by that cat of that individual, thus increasing the chance that that Toxoplasma gondii organism can complete its life cycle by getting back into a feline and sexually reproducing in the cat gut. You with me? There's a lot. Okay. It's funky. And I think really, really fascinating. But this plays out not just in rats, but it plays out in a variety of different species. Also, there actually have been a couple of studies recently looking at one with hyenas and lions in Africa. And they found that those hyenas that were infected with toxo were more likely to engage in risky behaviors and ultimately get killed by lions and potentially consumed by them. And they found with wolves something similar. This was in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, that it impacted the behavioral traits of wolves in that ecosystem also, again, taking more risky behaviors. Something that also plays out with people, as it turns out. There have been a number of studies that have looked at how Toxoplasma infection in people can modify behavior. Some of these are on the top right of your screen. toxo impairs memory in infected seniors. It's a public health problem. Well, that's sort of separate. But how and why toxoplasma makes us crazy? So there are a number of studies that are looking at how toxo interacts with the host organism, this intermediate host, and then modifies their behavior. But that's not the only way that toxoplasma infection can have implications for people. Mostly people hear about toxoplasmosis from their OBGYN. When they get pregnant, the OBGYN says, do not change cat litter. And they may or may not even tell you why, actually. But the reason is because you can get toxoplasmosis, and it can be very detrimental for the development of the fetus, up to and including miscarriages, but also blindness, mental retardation, deafness, just a bunch of things you do not want your fetus to get. But then it's also just really identified as a major concern for those with compromised immune systems like HIV or AIDS, but can even affect those who are otherwise, normal, healthy adults. Up to organ failure. Multi-organ failure was observed at least in one patient I'm thinking of, and can cause deaths. So you don't want Toxoplasma gondii. It will not always cause these horrible outcomes. It could be as little as flu-like symptoms, but it can also be really bad. So you do not want it. But nevertheless, there are about 1 million new cases or new infections with Toxoplasma gondii among people in the United States every year, and 3,000 cases of what's called ocular toxoplasmosis. So that's this image on the top left. This is a cyst that has formed within the eyeball of somebody, which can cause blindness as one of the outcomes. So this is not necessarily great news, but I want to be clear that not every if you have a domestic cat, a pet cat that you keep inside, and you do not feed it raw meat, you feed it, commercial cat food, the risk from that individual cat is very low. It's not likely to be excreting oocysts. But for those that are roaming the environment, the risk is actually considerably higher. And as many as 74%, at least in one study, of domestic cats will host Toxoplasma gondii during their lifetime in the United States. We're going to take questions at the end. Thanks. But so this is problematic then when you have large numbers of domestic cats roaming in the environment, potentially contaminating it with these Toxoplasma gondii oocysts, and especially near areas with at-risk populations, like was observed in this one study here, where they found that 82% of cats in the area were within roaming distance of public elementary or preschool grounds, public parks or community gardens, places where especially kids will frequently touch anything and everything and put it in their mouth. Kids playing in sandboxes like this little kid here, and they're older, maybe more immunocompromised individuals in certain areas. So we just want to be very mindful about the potential risks when we're talking about domestic cats roaming outside from a public health perspective. I'll also mention that this toxoplasmosis is among the top 5 neglected parasitic diseases by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And one of the reasons it is particularly problematic from the CDC's perspective is not just from the environmental contamination from, say, the infected sandbox or the garden where you might be digging, but also because of the way it can move through the ecosystem and through the consumption of contaminated meat in particular. And so toxoplasmosis is actually the second leading cause of death among foodborne illnesses in the United States after salmonellosis. And the reason is because, like I said, it can infect any bird or mammal. Many mammals that we eat, such as pigs, goats, and sheep, can become infected. And not only is that a risk directly for people, but it is an economic risk for those producers who are relying on the successful reproduction of healthy young to keep up their herds and then sell them at some later date. So it can infect a large number of domestic animals, like these 3 listed here, chickens, and even can be a problem not even on animals, but on the environment itself, including produce. So there was a great study a couple of years ago in Virginia that looked at the prevalence of toxo among, they went to farmers markets and retail grocery stores. They were organic and conventional produce, and they tested to see whether or not they got any Toxoplasma gondii oocysts on that produce. And of course, I'm talking about it now because they did find it. So please do make sure you're washing your fruits and vegetables prior to consumption of those things to make sure you do not get toxoplasmosis. So it's also a concern for wildlife, as you might have guessed. And toxo moves through the environment, as I mentioned. So this image on the bottom left is from a study in California where they were looking at the movement of Toxoplasma gondii oocysts from the highlands in California, in the mountains. And this included from mountain lions, bobcats, and domestic cats. And then as it moved through the watershed down into the nearshore environment, ultimately they found that southern sea otters, which are a threatened species, were being infected and ultimately dying either directly or indirectly. One of the interesting things about the occurrence of toxo in southern sea otters is it makes them more available to depredation by sharks. So this also moves through other environments. So in California, you have mountain lions, bobcats, and domestic cats all together. In Hawaii, so that's where this graphic on the right is from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administrations, but they're talking about Hawaiian monk seals. There are no other felines. It's only domestic cats. So if there is Toxoplasma gondii in the environment, you know exactly where it's coming from. And of course there's actually a lot of it. And we find that a lot of Hawaiian wildlife are testing positive for Toxoplasma gondii infection, including Hawaiian monk seals, of which there are only about 300 remaining in the main Hawaiian Islands. So this has significant impacts from a conservation standpoint for that species, and NOAA Fisheries is very concerned about it. They've called it their top disease concern for the ongoing recovery, hopefully, of Hawaiian monk seals. And then for other wildlife, especially, or in addition to just the general care we have for the healthy populations of wildlife, but also because of the potential impact that those wildlife might have for further infection of other species or for people, like white-tailed deer. There was a study in northern Ohio that found about 60% of white-tailed deer were positive for infection with Toxoplasma gondii. And I should mention that once you get toxo, you got it. You got it for life. There's no getting rid of it. It will insist in your tissues and very frequently in your central nervous system. That's one of the reasons why we see this modification of various behaviors among the host organisms. All right, have I scared you? Yeah, sorry, it does tend to have that effect, but it's such a fascinating little disease. Don't you think? The behavioral modifications. Thanks. Anyway, you could spend a lifetime studying toxo and still not understand it completely. So quick review there. Domestic cats are a top source of rabies, the top source of rabies among domestic animals in the United States, and are a major source of environmental contamination for Toxoplasma gondii, the parasite that causes toxoplasmosis in people and in wildlife. So I want to throw it back here, I guess, to the initial takeaway message that I brought up in the beginning. So again, domestic cats can make wonderful pets, but when they're roaming outdoors, they can have significant harms to birds and other wildlife, as well as represent public health threats and other things. So domestic cat management is essential. How can we accomplish that? Well, to reduce domestic cat populations in the environment, we have to first turn off the tap. That means get control of our owned pet population. No longer can we afford to have the owned cat population bleeding into the unowned cat population, which is a sort of a separate beast. But we have to get control of our cats, our pet cats. That's where we have the where control is really the easiest. But while we're thinking about control options, management options to minimize the risks that have been identified previously, we have to consider, are those cats still roaming outdoors? And of course, if they are, then everything we've talked about up to this point, predation and disease risks still exist. Hence the name of the program, Cats Indoors. So what are the management solutions? Keep your cat indoors. Or if you want to let it go outside, there are a variety of safe ways to do that. Safe for your cat, safe for wildlife, safe for people, like walking your cat on a leash. Yes, you can do that. Like rolling it around in a stroller, like Louie here, like building a catio, a screened-in patio for cats, a catio. And that can be as small as like a little window box, or it can be enormous and be like an entire screened-in porch, whatever you want to have. But that's a great way to provide some stimulation to your cat, give it a little outdoor time, some fresh air, some sunlight, but to do so in a way that keeps cats and the environment separate and both kept safe. And I'll just point out that this is completely in line with recommendations by the American Veterinary Medical Association and their policy statement on free roaming owned cats. Oh dear. Okay, let's see if this is not going to work. Can I get to the others? Aha. Let's see if this works. So I think it will. One of the reasons that it's best to keep cats indoors is because it's for the health and welfare of the cat itself. Cats, when roaming outdoors, are subject to a variety of injuries, diseases, and other risks, like coyotes, which will absolutely go after cats. And we have a video here that might work. The cat survives, just in case you're cringing. And we're not going to show the whole thing anyway. All right, I think we get the idea. Yeah, so that's what eventually. Yeah, that's a great place to stop it. Suspense. No, so what eventually happens? I mean, we don't need to watch another minute of this to figure it out. But the cat does climb up one of those posts on the deck, and then the coyote ends up leaving. But this, I think, does a good job of illustrating why it's risky for cats to roam outdoors. There are coyotes everywhere. There are coyotes around here. And in addition to the threat directly to the cat, but because cats are closely associated with people, it brings coyotes in close contact with people also, which creates a whole set of other risks that we don't necessarily want. Brings them in, and where they might find other food sources around people, they might become habituated to human environments and again, cause conflicts. Okay, let's get this mouse back. Here we go. So there are other reasons why you should choose, in my opinion, to keep your cat indoors. They are far less likely to be exposed to parasites. They actually are 3 times more likely to be infected with parasites when they are roaming outside. Of course, they are subject to being hit by cars. So many cats killed by cars when you go down the road. It's just much safer for the health and safety of your cat. And again, this is consistent, as I mentioned, with the AVMA statement. You can read it, but basically they identify these risks associated with cats roaming in the environment, some of which we've already talked about, and they clearly specify it's also much better for the environment, for wildlife, for people when cats are kept inside the home. And from a disease control perspective, keeping cats inside or safely, on a leash, etc., while roaming outside is of course better. This on the top left is taken from the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians Compendium of Animal Rabies Prevention and Control. And yeah, as you can see in yellow, their recommendations are that stray dogs, cats, and ferrets should be removed from the community. They also recommend that all dogs, cats, and ferrets should be vaccinated against rabies and revaccinated in accordance with recommendations in this compendium, which means given an initial rabies vaccination, vaccinated again after 1 year, and then vaccinated every 1 to 3 years to maintain a high enough titer level to not get rabies. So one rabies vaccination and done is not sufficient. Then also for toxoplasmosis, this study, I pulled out this quote here, but basically it says, when you continue to allow domestic cats roaming in the environment, you are facilitating Toxoplasma gondii contamination of the environment and transmission to wildlife, domestic animals, and people. So we really need to be thinking about domestic cat management from a One Health perspective. This is the idea that domestic animal, human, wildlife health are all interconnected and connected with the environment. And so, we can take steps to manage domestic cats in a way that protects cats, that benefits other domestic animals, that benefits wildlife, that benefit people, and it leads to these benefits in environmental health as well. So what can you do? Well, have you heard of the Bird City Network? Some, yeah. That is one of the great ways to engage your city in not just domestic cat issues, but in a wide variety of bird conservation issues. Get certified as a bird city. This is led in Texas. I believe it's led by Texas Parks and Wildlife and Audubon, Texas. And there are, go online to birdcity.org. You can find more information. But there are a great number of steps you can take to get your city certified and implementing great conservation measures where you live. You can also share information about the Cats Indoors program, or not really the Cats Indoors program, but about why it's beneficial to keep cats indoors. You can enact ordinances in your hometown, things like sterilization, preventing cats from running at large, identification, vaccination. You can be a model of appropriate cat ownership behaviors in your area. And one of those includes maybe taking the pledge to keep cats indoors. So in final review, I want to say this isn't really anything revolutionary. All I'm talking about here is basically treating cats like we treat dogs. It's that simple, and it's about being a good neighbor. Take responsibility for your pet cat, please. Don't let it trespass on the property of others. Don't let it become a nuisance for others. Don't let it ruin the resources that we all love so much throughout the area. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Appreciate your time.
So first question. Go ahead.
Yes, you were very kind to wait. So the question is, does a cat eventually get rid of toxo, no longer host the parasite after it has had it? Yeah. No, the cat will always host it. So the cat will not show symptoms typically of hosting toxo. It's this kind of cool evolutionary pathway between felines and toxo. But the cat will not necessarily be excreting it throughout its lifetime. In fact, a single cat will probably excrete toxo for a period of 1 to 3 weeks, but it then can re-excrete it later in its life if a few things happen, if it becomes immune compromised, if its immunity drops for any reason, or if it is re-exposed or exposed to a new strain of toxo. There are multiple strains of toxo, unfortunately. So if once it has it, it is potentially a transmission risk if you're going to be interacting with that cat's feces. But it takes a couple of days for the oocyst to, it's called sporulate, to basically become infectious. So if you are changing your cat litter daily, or really maybe even every other day, but definitely daily, and your cat is excreting Toxoplasma gondii, you're still not likely to become infected with it as a result of that interaction. Is there a test for the cat? Yeah, you can do a blood test, or you can test its feces, but that will only tell you if it is excreting it at that moment in time. A blood test will tell you whether or not it ever has been exposed to it. Okay, next question. Online. Oh, long. How much of the problem is domestic cats and how much is it about feral cats? Okay, so feral cats are domestic cats. It's a silly little nuance, but one that I made in the beginning of the talk. So I'll just be consistent. So all feral cats are also considered domestic cats. They're the same species. That's the common name of the species. Let's see. My question is about Felis catus in both cases, but I'm differentiating between. Cats that get medical attention and food at home versus home. Okay. How much of the concerns are associated with pet cats versus not pet cats? It depends on what concerns we're talking about. In terms of wildlife depredation, it's the estimate is 69% of the 2.4 billion birds killed by domestic cats every year is from unowned cats, and that isn't specifically feral cats, but it's the designation they used in the study. And then 31% would be from owned cats. But when we come to public health concerns, disease transmission, I can't give you specific. They're both likely, equally likely, I guess, to be passing on a variety of these things. Certainly, a cat with access to veterinary treatment, regular veterinary treatment, is less likely to have problems, but it may still have some of these issues. And if it's then interacting with a person, it's more likely to expose that person to whatever it might have. So the simple answer is by not letting cats roam outdoors, you eliminate all these problems. Okay, from the audience, yes, ma'am. Correct. So the question is, are there still cats roaming around outside in Canada? And there are. Yeah. Obviously, there are pet cats up there, but there are also unowned cats roaming around in the landscape. Certainly, it is tougher for them to survive. They have much harsher winters than we do here, but they are still capable of it. And again, unlike wildlife, they have this closer association with people, and so they have access to human provided resources, and that helps with their survival in some cases. But the numbers of, so you probably saw in the graph, it was 204 million birds are estimated to be killed every year by cats in Canada. And that's because they have far fewer cats than we do in the United States and people. Yeah, which is basically the same thing, but yeah. Okay, another question from the chat. Yeah. I'm surprised it took this long. We have a huge community cat population in the county. Many are in managed colonies. What is the humane solution for outdoor cats? I don't believe we have had any cats testing positive for rabies, maybe 3 or 4 years. How many cases of toxo have we had? We work closely with animal services. So I didn't get into, we could do a whole other talk about unowned cat management and the science associated with that. But in short, I think going back to my comment about effective management of domestic cats generally, if they are still roaming in the environment, they are still a problem for wildlife. They are still a disease transmission risk. They are still a nuisance for the people who live around them. So the best way to manage them, the most effective way for sure, and the most effective way to minimize their population and the risks and the concerns they have in the environment is to remove them from the landscape. No. Yeah, I know we're going to disagree on this. I can tell from your shirt, but that is not the solution I would recommend. Sterilization is great. It is certainly something I would highly recommend for every single owned cat, but as an unowned cat population management tool, it has thus far been proven to be unsuccessful and, of course, facilitates the ongoing harms to wildlife, disease transmission risks, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, another question from the audience. Yes, ma'am. It's a harder question to answer than it seems like it should be because the number changes based on the season. So yeah, in the winter it drops considerably, and then in the like June, July, it soars with all the new fledglings that exist. So certainly some component of that 2.4 billion are birds that would have died anyway, sort of compensatory mortality. But I think the question then becomes, how would they have died? And if they hadn't died to a domestic cat, maybe they would have died from predation by a native predator and still helped out the native wildlife community. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen 10 to 20 billion thrown around.
Could you repeat the question for the
thank you.
online
Sorry.
people?
The question was, how many birds are there? And I said that's hard to know. But then the follow-up question was kind of what's a minimum? And I said the number is that I've seen thrown around is 10 to 20 billion, more or less. Yeah, and I'm not here to say, I talked about the 3 billion bird net loss over the last 50 years. I'm definitely not saying that's all from cats. It's not. But cats are one of those nails in the coffin. Yes, sir. Are we done with the chat then? Okay, you're asking. The question is, do I have any examples of small Texas towns that have done a good job of getting their cat population under control? Not off the top of my head, I'm afraid. I would need to do a little homework on that. Yes, sir. How many birds does the typical outdoor cat kill every year? 20 to 50 birds per year. Yeah, that's probably a bit high. So some cats will kill more than others, obviously. The real impact is not that any one individual cat kills thousands of birds. It's that you have 100 million cats running around in the outdoors. We know best estimate of the own cat population is about 100 million. And then the unowned cat population is kind of anybody's guess. But the paper that estimated 2.4 billion birds used 30 to 80 million as their number of unowned cats. But I've seen this, up in over 100 million estimated before too. So nobody really knows, but it's a lot. It's absolutely a lot. Okay. Oh, one more. Oh, do we have a stat on environmental chemical kills of birds versus cats? I'm not sure what's meant by environmental chemical kills. We have numbers on pesticides, and it's not even close. Cats are way more. That goes back to the graph that I showed earlier. The 2.4 billion birds of this is direct human caused bird mortality, way higher than any other. I think it's higher than all of the others, at least in that graph combined. Although I'd have to check that. But it's far higher than everything else. The next closest is collisions with windows, which is cats are 4 times greater than that. So pesticides also important, but in terms of total magnitude of bird mortality, cats are more important. Don't tell my colleague who works on pesticides that I said that. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.